With their raids and destruction of settlements, the Apache Indians established dominance over the Spanish. But Spanish technology brought about a far more menacing and destructive presence that would completely alter the balance of power in the area and drive the Apache people to the verge of extinction. This is a story that narrates the turbulent period of intense tribal warfare and unrelenting invasion, as well as the startling reality that led to the downfall of the Apache Indians. Observe how the Apache, a former dominant force, were destroyed by the Comanche's expeditions of unrelenting raids and assault in a merciless war extermination. The soldiers that marched through what are now the northern states of Mexico during the American invasion of that country in 1846 found it to be desolate. The U.S. Army advanced through uninhabited ghost towns, where bodies were left to decay in the heat, past burned-out villages, and along deserted highways. It was as if northern Mexico had already been vanquished when the U.S. invasion got underway. Historian Pekka Hämäläinen said, "The Comanche, the native people that ruled most of the Southwest, were said to be responsible for the devastation of northern Mexico. In addition to preventing the Spanish Empire from advancing farther into what would eventually become the United States, the Comanche had effectively converted the Spanish possessions of Texas and New Mexico into their own virtual states." Soon after Mexico gained its independence from Spain, Comanche warbands advanced far into the heart of the newly sovereign but war-torn nation. They created a 1,000-mile stretch of battle paths that cut across the jungles, mountains, and deserts of Mexico. Within a 3-day ride of Mexico City, Comanche warriors were raiding communities. The Comanche caused the U.S. Army to find the route to the capital of Mexico completely open. But how and why did the Comanche cause such destruction in Mexico and inadvertently create the groundwork for American invasion in the process? The story started 150 years before the U.S.-Mexico War, when the Comanche started to establish an indigenous kingdom by controlling the commerce in bison skins and horses over the Great Plains and beyond. The Pueblo Indians, who were residing in the Spanish province of New Mexico, revolted in 1680. They started a profitable horse trade, drove the Spanish out of the area, and gained possession of a good number of Spanish horses. Following well-traveled native trading routes that followed the eastern border of the Rocky Mountains, as the mountain range eventually dissolved into the Great Plains, the horse trade migrated north from New Mexico. The native peoples who lived in the center of what would eventually become the United States had not yet experienced horses, since they had not been discovered in the Americas prior to European contact. Horses were a revolutionary invention because they allowed tribes to travel enormous distances, trade extensively, hunt, and fight wars. These advantages were both immediate and lasting. In less than 10 years, the Shoshone people, who reside where the Great Plains cut through present-day Wyoming and Montana, were contacted by this native horse commerce. Shoshone life revolved around bison hunting, which was made much simpler by horses. However, the Shoshone were also exposed to diseases that were common throughout the vast linked landmasses of Africa, Europe, and Asia as a result of dealing in items that originated in Spanish areas. These diseases, however, had never before been discovered in the Americas, and Native Americans were thus immune to them. A significant portion of the Shoshones broke off and traveled south along the eastern border of the Rocky Mountains, following the flow to its source in New Mexico. As they became victims of the same contact-induced illnesses that claimed the lives of millions of Native Americans. This group was presumably trying to get away from the epidemic, but it also seems like they were trying to make a name for themselves in the horse trade, which had the obvious potential to completely transform Native American culture. They forged an alliance with the Utes when they got closer to the New Mexican horse supply, hence the name Uter. The Spanish had just recently retaken New Mexico, and the Utes had long looted their horses, sharing their knowledge of how to use them for transport, trading, hunting, and warfare. These two partnered tribes took so many horses from the Spanish throughout the course of the following generation that the settlers in New Mexico were left without enough horses to mount a defense. The new group from the north was quickly being derided by the Spanish as Comanches, which is the Ute term for enemy. The Comanches, who were now well stocked with horses and knowledgeable about the Spanish frontiers, moved eastward into the Great Plains of the Southwest in 1720, where vast herds of horses could be fed on the seemingly endless grassland. Comanche-owned herds were enormous once they were on the plains. The Comanche were able to hunt bison very successfully because of their horses, and they quickly understood that if they put all of their energy into hunting bison and growing their herds, they could control the local commerce in horses, bison hides, and bison meat. With the knowledge that they could exchange these items for all the food they required, the Comanche abandoned farming and foraging in favor of concentrating only on bison and horses. The Comanches waged war against their principal rival on the southern plains, the Apache, in an attempt to remove trade competition and dominate the horse and bison trade, particularly with regard to the food supplies they depended upon. The Apache had prospered as farmers on the plains, but the same fields turned against them in times of conflict. The Apache had to protect the areas where they were planted and relied upon for food and shelter, whereas the Comanche, who were nomads, had no crops or settlements to assault. Comanches wore down their rivals on the plains by charging into Apache communities in the cover of night, demolishing their food stores, slaughtering their animals, setting their houses on fire, and then vanishing into the night. They paired this rapid guerrilla-style attack with enormous frontal attacks aimed at enslaving as many women and children as possible and murdering as many Apache men. A number of these slaves were sold on the vibrant New Mexico slave markets, following a practice common to the region's indigenous peoples. Others were adopted or married into families, eventually becoming Comanches themselves. Apaches were driven off the plains areas of what is now New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma by 1740. Some went even farther south, onto the plains of Spanish Texas. Others relocated to the area around the Rio Grande and the modern boundary between the United States and Mexico. Following their victory against the Apache, the Comanche took control of the southern Great Plains, which they later dubbed Comancheria. They soon established themselves as the area's main providers of bison goods and horses, and they started constructing a vast trading network that allowed them to conquer much of the surrounding area. The Comanches provided horses and bison robes to the French settlers in the Louisiana Territory in the 1740s by acting as middlemen between the two areas with other native tribes. They equally got manufactured goods from France in exchange, such as improved cannons created by the Spanish, iron axes, lances, and arrows with metal tips. Afterwards, the Comanche raided Spanish-controlled New Mexico using their superior firepower to get horses, which they sold to the French for additional weaponry. This cycle had produced active trade lines between French Louisiana and Comancheria by 1750. The Comanche population reached 15,000 by 1750 and was still growing rapidly. Their ability to exchange prized horses and bison robes for an abundance of a wide variety of sustenance was the primary cause of their population explosion. They certainly had 30,000 or more horses in their herds, and those numbers were growing quickly as well. To give their horses adequate room to graze and locate water, the Comanches had divided into dozens of bands by now, each made up of big extended families. There was pressure to expand into new areas as a result of the quick population expansion and the need to capture new markets. So, the Comanche tribes to the south advanced into the wide plains of Spanish Texas, home to 1 million wild horses. Perhaps more significantly, however, were the plentiful supply of domesticated horses that were waiting to be taken from the isolated and exposed Spanish missions and presidios. Because training wild horses required weeks of labor and great expertise, Comanches looked for a susceptible and plentiful supply of domesticated horses that could be transferred right once in order to control the horse trade in the area. This would cause the Comanches to continuously push into new raiding territories throughout the course of the next century. Upon reaching the southern plains of Spanish Texas, the Comanche came across their erstwhile Apache rivals, whom they had driven south. They went out to drive the Apache out of the area once more, but this time the Apaches sided with the Spanish. In response, the Comanche formed their own alliance with the minor indigenous communities in the area, who felt left out of the Apache-Spanish alliance. Armed with French firearms and an army of up to 2,000 warriors, the Comanche-led coalition, known as the Norteños by the Spanish, assaulted Spanish missions and presidios. Well-armed Comanche warriors, by now among the strongest horseback riders on the continent, overcame reinforcement forces dispatched from Mexico City. They outran the Spanish in terms of speed, outmatched them in horseback combat, and employed guerrilla warfare strategies that the Spanish were unable to adapt to. The Spanish were made to acknowledge that they were not the dominant force in Texas by the Comanche. Apaches withdrew from their alliance with the Spanish in an effort to placate the Comanche, and they took refuge along the present-day border between the United States and Mexico. After being driven off the plains and losing all ties with the Spanish, the Apache began a decades-long campaign of organized raids on the Spanish towns located in what is now northern Mexico. But the Spanish witnessed a fortune in 1763. Or so they believed. After losing the 7 Years' War, the French were compelled to cede the Louisiana Territory to Spain in that year. Spain believed the Comanches would no longer have access to firearms, gunpowder, and ammunition after the French were gone. They reasoned that the Comanches would have to stop their raids in order to improve commercial ties with Spanish territory and have access to European manufactured products, and that they would have to turn to the Spanish for those items. The Spanish also believed that they would be able to fortify their colonies in Texas, New Mexico, and Spanish Louisiana when the Comanches stopped their attacks, so enclosing the Comanche to the west, south, and east. But the Comanche had other plans. They had taken over every area of the Great Plains suitable for horse breeding and rearing at this point. Breeding was not possible in the northern plains because the winters were harsh for foals to survive. Winter blizzards might occasionally freeze whole herds, even on the central plains just north of Comancheria. They realized that in order for their northern neighbors to be viable both militarily and economically, they needed a constant supply of young horses, so they set out to provide. The Comanche gained access to British markets and firearms by giving horses to the native populations of the northern plains who traded with British Canada. Concurrently, Spanish authorities were unable to maintain control over the boundaries of Spanish Louisiana, and smugglers from France and Britain, who aimed to undermine Spain, advanced into the lucrative lower Mississippi trading sector. As a result, the Comanche began to receive large quantities of weapons from both the north and the east. One account claims that 17 horseloads of weapons were traded for one horse. In 1767, a Spanish report warned that Comanches were better equipped than Spanish forces, despite the Spanish aim of hemming the Comanches in on three sides and denying them access to weapons in 1763. At trade shows in New Mexico by the 1770s, the Comanches were peddling highly sought-after British and French manufactured products. Spanish settlers now turned to the Comanche, instead of the Comanche resorting to them for manufactured items. The Comanche, however, prioritized giving horses to the French, the British, and the Plains Indians, and the New Mexicans had an abundance of horses. So this kind of commerce was not their primary priority. Now that they were independent of the Spanish markets in New Mexico, the Comanches tried to use the Spanish colony for their own ends. The Comanches conducted more than 100 raids into New Mexico during the 70s, stealing thousands of horses and selling them to the French, British, and Great Plains Aboriginal peoples. Through the destruction of crops, ranches, food storage facilities, irrigation systems, and the mass killing of cattle herds, Comanche raiding teams also aimed to progressively undermine the Spanish colony. Their ruin was calculated because the Comanche rendered New Mexicans dependent on Comanche commerce, even as they attacked them by depriving the state of food, resources, and the capacity to be productive. Simultaneously, they consistently ensured that farms and ranches had just enough supplies to restock their horse herds, allowing them to be plundered once more later on. During their raids, the Comanches also killed hundreds of fighting-age New Mexican men and sold hundreds of New Mexican women and children into slavery. Some of these people were sold into the Comanches' vast network of trade, while others were employed as laborers in Comancheria to take care of the endless bison hides and horses. Whole villages ran away in terror. The map of New Mexican towns disappeared. Santa Fe, the nation's capital, was teeming with refugees by 1780, when it was the only place unaffected. Native Americans who had previously feared the Spanish now tended to associate with Comanche alliances and markets, and spoke more Comanche than Spanish. The governor's palace was decorated with strings of dried Indian ears hanging above its portal, symbolizing Spanish dominance over the region's indigenous people. Contrary to what Spanish administrators had anticipated, excess products from the province of New Mexico were sent eastward into Comancheria, rather than south into Mexico. In name alone, New Mexico had turned into a Spanish colony. As if the evil melted on the Apache and other neighbors by the dominant Comanche were not enough. Fast forward to the 1830s. The Comanches launched more extensive raiding operations than at any other time in their history in the 10 years that separated Texan independence from the United States-Mexico War. Between 1834 and 1847, at least 44 significant assaults into Mexico are documented by historian Brian DeLay. The majority of these expeditions had between 200 and 400 warriors, but some had as many as 800 or even 1,000. These were very well-planned invasions that traveled through several Mexican states. They targeted towns, haciendas, ranches, and mining settlements as they moved from target to target in accordance with well-thought-out strategy. To guarantee successful assaults, spies and scouts rode ahead. Along with stealing horses and slaves, raiding groups also killed fighting-age men, set fire to houses, destroyed food stores, and slaughtered any cattle they did not need for sustenance while on the raid. This was a practice that had been in place for a long time. After their strikes, the raiders dispersed in all directions to avoid being detected and regrouped at prearranged sites. The Comanches were able to maintain a military advantage because each warrior typically rode 3 or 4 specially bred war horses, which were better in speed and endurance and could not be purchased. When warriors were under attack, they would ride their horses until they were exhausted, then get off and mount another. Almost often, Comanches outpaced their attackers. In the years before the U.S. invasion, these raiders drove 1 million horses out of Mexico. Naturally, the northern Mexicans did not take the Comanche invasion lying down. In addition to wealthy hacienda owners fortifying their estates and hiring tiny private armies, they made every effort to create local militias. But what they really required was help from Mexico City to re-establish the old Spanish presidio system and supply new men to the border fortification. When such help was not forthcoming, the federal government chose to make use of its little resources to quell uprisings nearer the country's capital, rather than defending its outskirts. Due to their remote location and low population density, northern Mexico's farms, ranches, and villages were easy targets for skilled guerrilla fighters such as the Comanche. The occasional successful ambush and mass death of Comanche by Mexican troops only served to incite the Comanches to return and exact revenge. Due to the Comanche violence, many farmers, ranchers, and rural Mexicans fled the countryside in large numbers to safer metropolitan areas, leaving large swathes of northern Mexico uninhabited, unproductive, and vulnerable to attacks from farther into the nation. States tried various approaches as Mexico City was unwilling to support its northern states, and the local militias were dreadfully ineffective against the Comanche. The states of Durango, Sonora, and Chihuahua approved laws providing rewards for the scalps of Indians in the late 1830s. Soon after the Comanche drove the Apaches from the plains, mercenary groups would often ambush them in scalp-hunting battles that raged across northern Mexico. The Apaches had been raiding the area for decades. Unlike the Comanche, who rarely entered Mexico in huge raiding bands before leaving again for Comancheria, Apaches dwelt in the north of Mexico, making them easy targets. Comanche scalps were seldom taken by mercenaries. In fact, Comanches entered the scalping warfare and sold a large number of Apache scalps themselves, seeing a chance to profit from fighting their former Apache rivals. Then, the governments of Coahuila and Chihuahua made the decision to pay tribute to the Comanche by freely giving them their products in return for the tribesmen stopping their raids. However, paying tribute just served to drive Comanche raiding groups into neighboring states, particularly those farther south, and to continue depriving those governments of their resources. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to give a thumbs up and subscribe for more historical videos like this. See you in our next video.